You may have heard people say, if someone isn't on social media, they must be running away from something. But the truth is, some people simply no longer stand on the porch. They're still there, still living. They've just chosen to keep the light for the inside. And that choice says a great deal about how they see the world and how they see themselves. There is a moment that feels strangely familiar. You come home late. Nothing dramatic, no major incident. You stand at the door, your hand resting on the porch light switch, and you don't turn it on. Not because you're afraid of being seen, but because you no longer want to be seen. At least, not in that way. Inside the house, you still turn on a small lamp. A soft, warm glow. Enough to see what matters, enough to know where you are. You are still there, still living, still present in your own life. It's just that you're no longer standing on the porch, letting the light spill outward for passersby. If you're in this rhythm, pause here for a moment. Not to analyze, just to notice. Because many people have lived this moment and then blamed themselves for it. They ask, am I hiding? Am I becoming distant? Is something wrong with me? What few people tell you is this. Fatigue can be a reasonable signal. There is a kind of tiredness that only appears after a very long time under the lights. A fatigue that doesn't come from doing too much, but from being seen for too long, being watched, interpreted, held under a glare that never turns off, even when all you want is to rest in your own shade. You don't hate people. You haven't turned your back on the world. You've simply begun to notice that constant visibility comes with a quiet cost. Every time you share a moment, you're not just sharing an image, you're sharing the right to interpret it. Others look in and add things you never said. Assumptions, comparisons, expectations. And at some point, your body grows tired before you even have words for what's happening. You didn't sit down one day and decide, from now on, I'll be silent. There was no declaration, no promise to yourself. Just one day you didn't turn the light on anymore. Not because of darkness, but because there was already enough light inside. Someone out there might call this withdrawal, avoidance, shutting down, but they aren't standing in this house. They don't hear the door closing so gently. They don't see the desk lamp just bright enough to let your breath slow. You do, and that is enough. You don't have to explain why you no longer want to post. You don't have to recount how tired you've been. You don't have to prove that this silence is justified. You don't have to explain, because this silence isn't necessarily avoidance. For many people, it's a form of self-respect, one that only those who have stood under the lights for too long can truly understand. You once stood on the porch. You once turned the light on. You once let the world look in. And now, you're simply choosing to keep the light for the inside. There is nothing wrong with that. There is something important that needs to be made clear. Very clear. And very gently. You weren't the first one to withdraw. Your body did it before you did. Imagine this house, not emotionally, but through its simplest structure. There are moments when the electrical system is overloaded, not because of a single appliance, but because too many things are on at once. The porch light, the living room lamp, the TV hum, phone notifications, comments, unread messages, small noises stacking up, never fully turning off. And then a soft, almost inaudible click. The main breaker shuts down. The first thing that goes dark isn't the rooms inside. It's the porch light, the outward-facing lights, the ones meant to be seen. Inside the house, there is still light, dimmer, but enough to live. That is exactly what happened to you. When the pace became too dense, when information kept pouring in, when words, images, feedback, expectations layered over each other without pause, the body doesn't sit down to analyze. It doesn't debate. It doesn't ask for permission. It does the only thing it knows how to do: protect what energy remains at the core. In psychology, this process is described very simply: overload, then fatigue, then strain, and finally, withdrawal. Not withdrawal from life, but from channels that demand too much presence. When information moves too fast, when systems become too complex, when social connection leaves no room to breathe, the body sends signals of exhaustion before you ever get the chance to think that something is wrong with you. And One of the first things to be disconnected are the spaces that require you to constantly face outward, not because you're weak, not because you failed, but because your nervous system recognized something deeply practical. Not every light needs to be on. This fatigue is not laziness. It is not a lack of motivation. It is a biological signal, like pain that tells you to stop, like sleepiness that insists you rest. When energy runs low, the body always shuts down the outward-facing systems first. You stop posting, stop responding, stop explaining how you're living, not because your life has disappeared, but because you're preserving it. You keep the light for the rooms you still need to be in, for meals that don't need to be recorded, for moments that don't need witnesses. And when the quiet arrives, it doesn't feel like a victory. It feels like a pocket of space just enough to breathe again. That's when many people begin to blame themselves. Am I hiding? Am I giving up? But if you look closely, you'll see you never left the house. You simply let the main breaker do its job, cut back, protect the core. And when you understand this, something important shifts. Stopping your posts no longer feels like a shameful choice. It becomes what it truly is, a self-protective reflex that happened before you even had words for it. You didn't do anything wrong. Your body was simply saying, enough. Keep the light inside. Stay in a little longer. Something strange happens when you spend too long under the porch light. You start carrying it inside the house. Even after the door is closed. Even when the room is empty. You stand in a dark room, yet it still feels as if a thin beam of light is shining in from somewhere outside. Not real light, but the light of an imagined gaze. An audience that isn't sitting in front of you, yet sits very clearly in your mind. You might be eating dinner, the plate still warm, the smell of butter, pepper, fresh bread, and yet, in a small corner of your thoughts, a familiar question appears. Which angle would look best? Story or post? What caption fits the mood? You might be laughing, a real laugh, a rare moment, and then a thought slips in. If I post this, what will people think? If I don't, will anyone know I'm okay? You might be sad, genuinely sad, too sad to talk to anyone. And right then, the audience in your head turns on. Should I write something? Should people see that I'm hurting? Or should I look strong? No one is looking at you. And yet, you feel watched. It's a very quiet kind of tension. Not panic, not drama, just this sense that you are rarely alone all the way. And that is exhausting. Perhaps what tires you out is not the world's gaze itself, but how rarely you're allowed to be fully alone. In psychology, there is a distinction between two forms of self-awareness. One points outward, how I appear in other people's eyes. The other points inward, what I am actually feeling. When you live too long under the porch light, the outward-facing awareness grows too large. It spills into meals, into trips, into moments you never intended to share. You're no longer just living. You're living with an overlay of observation, of prejudgment, of pre-explanation, of pre-definition. And that layer consumes a great deal of energy. No one needs to judge you. You've learned to do it for them, quickly, automatically. The feeling can resemble a prolonged state of alertness. Not because you've lost control, but because your nervous system has grown used to being watched. You leave the house for work, and it feels as if the lights are already on, even though no one turned them on. You send a message and hear an echo in your head. Did that sound weird? Could it be misunderstood? Will I seem cold? You post something small, and then you wait. Not for likes, but for a subtle, invisible confirmation that you still belong to the world. And if it doesn't come, your mind starts to spin. Am I disappearing? Am I being left behind? This isn't because you're weak. It comes from something deeply human, the need to belong. But there is something else, equally human, the need for autonomy. In theories of human motivation, autonomy doesn't mean doing whatever you want. It means the feeling, this is my choice. I am not being pulled. I am not being forced to be visible. In some online spaces, the pressure doesn't come as commands, it comes as a constant sense that you should be present, that you should update, respond, prove that you're still here. No one says it out loud. but you hear it anyway. That's when the audience in your head grows louder, and the house inside you begins to lose its right to close the door. You no longer turn the lights off when you choose to. You turn them off when you're depleted, until one day, the main breaker trips, and the porch light goes first. You stop posting, stop presenting, stop explaining. At first, there may be an uncomfortable gap, like a house that has suddenly grown too quiet. You hear the ticking of the clock. Your hand may reach for your phone without thinking, a habit that hasn't caught up yet. You might ask yourself, am I becoming antisocial? But then something else arrives. Relief. Not the relief of victory, but the relief of finally no longer living with an audience. You eat without thinking about angles. You cry without thinking about captions. You laugh without needing witnesses. You begin to live inside the house without hearing footsteps on the porch. And when you notice this, a very simple sentence can be spoken, not to push against anyone, just to return things to their proper place. I'm not against society. I'm protecting my mind. There is a very subtle difference between not being able to capture and choosing not to. That difference has nothing to do with technology, nothing to do with the times. It has everything to do with choice. You may still carry your phone. You still know how to take photos. You know how to record a moment if you want to. But in these moments, you choose not to. Not because you're judging anyone. Not because you think you're above it. It's just that you want to look with your own eyes first. There are moments that are very small. So small that if you rush, they pass without leaving a trace. Light moving through a window. Not bright. Just enough to see dust drifting slowly in the air. Someone sitting across from you, saying something that isn't especially important, but their voice is. The way they pause mid-sentence. The way they exhale. If you lift your phone, everything is still there, but the center shifts. Not because the camera ruins the moment, but because the instant you prepare to capture it, a part of your attention leaves the act of being in it. And sometimes, you simply want to be there completely, not dividing your presence. In the past, not because people lacked tools, but because there was no expectation to record, people tended to look longer. Not looking in order to remember, but looking because there was no reason to look away. They sat there, they breathed, and they let things unfold without needing proof. This isn't to say that now is worse. It only says this: the pressure has changed. The pressure to preserve, to show, to prove that the moment happened. And when that pressure disappears, your eyes are free again. You look at a meal without wondering how it would look in a frame. You look at the road ahead without thinking about how you'll describe it later. You simply look, not to share, not to store, but to be present. There is a form of presence that doesn't require validation. That doesn't need to be saved as data. It is enough because it is happening. And psychology confirms what your intuition has always known. It isn't the number of connections that makes us feel whole, it's the quality of presence. When you are truly there, even with just one person, even for a brief moment, a sense of fullness arrives naturally. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. You don't need to return to the past to find this. You don't need to reject the present either. You only need one small choice. In this moment, do I want to record or do I want to stay? And if you choose to stay, that says nothing negative about those who choose to record. It says only one thing about you. You are listening to your own needs. Some days, you'll take photos, and that's perfectly fine. Other days, you'll put the phone down, and that's perfectly fine too. The difference isn't in the action, but in who is deciding. When you sit in that room, looking out the window, with light untouched by a screen, time seems to slow. Not because the world stops moving, but because you're no longer chasing it. Your breathing deepens, slows, not to relax, but because nothing is pulling you anymore. In that moment, you're not thinking about how you'll tell this story later. You let it rest. Stay. Inside you. And sometimes, it is precisely the absence of recording that makes the memory clearer. Not because it was stored, but because you were truly present when it happened. There is something important that needs to be put back in its proper place. Not through argument, but through settling. Your choice to be silent is not a reaction. It is a right. A very basic right that we often forget in a world accustomed to turning every light on. This house, your life, is not a public space. It has doors, it has rooms, it has corners meant only for those who are truly invited. But when you live too long under the porch light, everything begins to blur. Strangers pass by, acquaintances peek in, and you forget that in a real house, guests need an invitation to enter. Online, however, the door can feel as if it's always wide open. No one forces you, no one commands you. There is just the feeling that if you don't turn the light on, you're somehow lacking. But this is something many people only realize after they're deeply tired. Not every light needs to be shared. Keeping the light is not secrecy, it is discernment. You choose which rooms are lit. You choose who gets to step inside. You choose when to be present and when not to be. That choice does not make you selfish. It gives you sovereignty. Research shows that many people step back from sharing not because they no longer have a life, but because they refuse constant self-disclosure. Not because they dislike connection, but because that connection has become too costly. When exhaustion accumulates, withdrawing from sharing is a very natural way to protect the core. Not to oppose anyone, but to avoid losing yourself. You don't need to say this out loud. No announcements, no long explanations, just one very small action, placing your hand on the light switch and not turning it on. In that moment, you're not shutting the world out. You're simply saying, not everyone needs to come in. Some people may misunderstand, some may call it distance, but they're standing on the porch. They can't feel the quiet inside this house. You can. And that quiet is not empty. It's full of breath, full of uninterrupted thought, full of feelings that don't need to be performed. In that quiet, you are not pulled, not interrupted, not required to respond. You move at your own pace. There is a way of living that doesn't require detoxing, doesn't require quitting, doesn't require resistance. It only requires greater awareness of what you give away. That awareness is not loud. It's like a house that knows how to distribute its light. Some rooms need brightness, some need only a soft dimness, and some don't need visitors at all. When you understand this, a familiar weight begins to fall away. You no longer have to prove that you're okay, no longer have to update to be remembered. You remember something simple. Your presence does not require an audience, and that doesn't make you disappear. It lets you stay more deeply. You choose when to share. You choose when to be silent. Not out of fear, but because you know how precious your light is. There will be times when you open the door, turn on the lights, invite others in, and that is completely fine. But this time, you do it from fullness, not from pressure. That's where the difference lives, not in the behavior, but in who holds the choice. When you keep that choice, silence is no longer an empty void. It becomes a steady space. A space where you know, if you need to, you can turn the light on. And if you don't, you are allowed to keep it. Night falls very slowly. There is no signal, no announcement. The light inside the house simply settles at a level that is enough. You don't do anything else. No summing up, no lessons drawn. You just stay. This house is still here, as it has always been. Before the noise, before the porch light that stayed on all night. There is nothing left to prove, no one waiting for you to turn the light on. You've passed the phase of having to explain your silence, to justify your withdrawal, to prove that this quiet is reasonable. Now, you no longer need any of that, because this quiet is not a position. It isn't a statement. It doesn't require agreement. It's simply the state you're in. Out there, the world keeps moving. Other houses still have their porch lights on. Stories are still being told, images are still being shared. You're not resisting that. You're not separating yourself from it either. You just don't need to step outside. Inside this house, there is no audience, no calling, no demand to be present, only breath returning to its proper place. You can hear it now, slower, deeper, not because you're trying to control it, but because nothing is pulling you anymore. Maybe, after this video ends, you'll return to your day. You'll work, you'll talk, you'll live. Nothing needs to change right now. Or maybe you'll let the video continue for a little while longer, not to learn anything more, just to have someone sit quietly with you in this room. If you've made it this far, you probably weren't looking for advice. You weren't looking for motivation either. You just needed a place that doesn't pull you anywhere, a place that allows you to stay without asking why. If that's true, then you're already in the right place. There's no need to respond, no need to leave a trace, no need to let anyone know you were here. Your presence does not need to be acknowledged to have value. This house is not measured by how many people visit. It's measured by how you feel inside it. And if one day you decide to open the door, turn on the lights, invite others in, you absolutely can. But that will be your choice, not an obligation. For now, you can leave the light as it is. Not brighter, not dimmer, just enough. You don't need to turn the light on to prove that you're alive. You are alive, right here,